Welcome to the CEC Report. It's January 27th and I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
In today's CEC Report, we're going to discuss how tariff cuts are another tool for population reduction. The IMF catches on. A bloodbath in property is carnage for the banks. And finally, Australia Day, made in China. So first, tariff cuts are another tool for population reduction. This week, the Toyota car making company announced it's going to sack something like 350 workers from its Altona plant here in Melbourne. Now, all workers in the car industry in Australia are currently in fear of their jobs. They're all on the chopping block.
Because of the flow into the parts industry, it's something like 10 times as many people. 3,500 at least.
It's a very significant industry in Australia, and we'll talk about some of the details of that. Now, faced with these job losses, you got a lot of politicians shedding crocodile tears. You know, they express their sympathy, but at the end of the day, they're causing them, because the same politicians will tell you and affirm repeatedly that they believe in free trade.
Yes.
Right? And it's the free trade that's done this. Tariff cuts began in this globalisation era under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, under the advice of economist Ross Garnaut, with the complicity of John Howard and John Hewson. And this complicity between both sides is what Gillard talks about as the post-1983 consensus on economic reform.
This is the same Ross Garnaut that was into the climate change report, correct?
Climate change Ross Garnaut, the man who's finishing off what's left of our industries, in other words.
So, I mean, this free trade policy, which we've talked about on this program many times as being a policy of the British Empire, the British system of monetarism, is being pushed by, again, another tool, another toady, Ross Garnaut.
No, Ross Garnaut.
Oh, yes.
Ross Garnaut has quite a few notches on his belt, Craig, when it comes to Australian industry, including the wool industry, but we can't go into the details of that. Now, interestingly, the current crisis, the intensity of the crisis in the car industry right now is being blamed on the Australian dollar. The Australian dollar is high, and it's making the export of our cars uncompetitive. But if that's true, then that's also should be blamed back to Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and Ross Garnaut, because they're the ones who floated the dollar. Yeah. Right? So the policies, the reform policies that began in the 80s have caused this. But here's the point. The history of Australian industry proves that what's happening to Australian industry now is not an unintended consequence of well-meaning reforms. It was the intention. And the example is, we're going to talk about John McEwen. Now, Black Jack McEwen was the country party leader, and he dominated the country party. He was the Trade Minister of Australia in the 50s and the 60s. He was also the Prime Minister for a short period of time in the late 60s. He was Australia's greatest protectionist. Labor Party MPs were naturally protectionist, but from the Conservative side, there was just as many free traders. McEwen was an arch protectionist. And interestingly, Craig, his position was influenced by a 1929 Tariff Board report, which did an inquiry into tariffs. And it, interestingly, focused on the relationship between protectionism and population. And what this report did is it said that if Australia didn't have tariffs, and this is back in 1929, our economy would be based on grazing and mining and have a maximum population of about 5 million people. And when it said that, Australia already had 9 million people, right? So it was clear from then to John McEwen that Australia could not develop as a proper nation without tariff protection. If we had free trade, we wouldn't develop. So given that this had already been discussed and these conclusions drawn, isn't it obvious, Craig, that the architects of free trade in this current era would have calculated the exact consequences of their tariff cuts that we're seeing now, not only in the deindustrialisation of Australia, but in the other thing that they're gunning for at the moment, the depopulation of Australia?
Well, that's the whole point of the issue of free trade. It's got nothing to do with trade per se, but population control. This is a British Empire policy. And if you ever look at, for example, where free trade was overturned, like in the case of the Abraham Lincoln period, what did you see? Huge population explosion, because the intention was to develop the local physical economy. Now, there's an interesting thing when you think about free trade and think about protectionism. Protectionism is usually, in the case of Australia, talking about the manufacturing sector. And back in that period of the 1929 period, 1930, Australia had a huge influence in world markets for the export of its commodities, particularly sheep, wool, that sort of thing, and also minerals, right? So Australia's income was governed by, in a sense, the world price for those things. Now, if you had free trade, right, the free trade would see the expansion of what we already had, which is this mining, this wooling industry. So therefore, the labour of that time would be channelled into those sorts of industries, and that's why you have people out in the rural sectors, and there's not a concentration in, say, the urban areas. Whereas if you have a protection, and the other thing is too, these mining industries as we see today, and also the agricultural industries, are governed by the oligarchy, are governed by these large resource companies like Rio Tinto, like Conagra, like these dominant forces that are governed top down by the empire.
And pastoral companies, which up until the turn of the last century were all headquartered in London.
Yeah, right. So they had a vested interest in controlling these commodity-based industries. When you have protectionism, you're actually invoking the right of a nation state to produce in the area of its own manufactures. So tariff control becomes very important as a mechanism of protecting the nation state, where you're basically saying, as a political principle, we want this industry. And the thing about manufacturing is it requires a higher grade of labour, it requires more labour to be in the urban areas, and consequently you end up with a higher quality of labour, a higher paid population, therefore a workforce, and therefore you can afford the population can afford more people. So when you have a manufacturing-based economy, as was seen in the Lincoln Revolution, what do you have? You have a population explosion because people are benefiting from the wealth of those manufacturers, as opposed to what happens when you've got an agricultural company or a mining company where those commodities are simply shipped out of the country for no benefit of the population as a whole.
And people shouldn't be surprised that once again we've found a policy like free trade that goes back at its core to this population issue, because if you go back to Malthus, who was the first professor of political economy, and Adam Smith, the great author of The Wealth of Nations, they designed British free trade with explicitly this targeting of population in mind.
Yeah, and I think with the car industry in particular, you have to understand, according to the research I've seen, for a car manufacturer to be viable, you need to produce around about 1 million cars per year. Now, Australian car manufacturers don't do anything like that, right? So where would you find the market to produce 1 million cars? Well, through population. Right. What if Australia had 50 to 100 million people? We would be able to support very easily a very viable machine tool car industry in this country. But we only have a small population relative to these sorts of industries. They're capital intensive, they require population in order to really survive. So there's no, unless Australia makes a decision not to have a car industry, tariffs are an absolute essential control that governments have to protect those sorts of industries.
And any politician who says they support the car industry but doesn't support tariffs is lying. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about how the IMF finally catches on about the threats facing Australia's economy. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So, the IMF has finally caught on that a bloodbath in property in Australia means carnage for Australia's banks. On the 20th of January, there was a screaming headline in the Herald Sun. Bloodbath to hit Australian real estate, analyst Jordan Wirtz says. And this Jordan Wirtz is an American analyst who's...
Of real estate.
Who's echoing essentially what a whole bunch of other international analysts have said and are more inclined to say than anyone in Australia.
Yeah, he sort of advises the top 500 CEOs or something like that.
Now, he has a perspective that's different for us. It echoes what we've said and what we've said for years about the property market in Australia. Mm-hmm. We come at it from a different standpoint. We're not interested in making predictions for financial gain, right? He advises customers on a commercial basis. Our interest is we know this is a total distortion, a deliberate distortion of the Australian economy. It's got to be fixed. The property market is an enormous burden that's crushing the people living in the houses.
Well,
the cost of the houses crushes them.
A number of the internal economists and real estate agents say there is no such thing as a housing bubble. Australia's not in a housing bubble. And then you have these analysts outside saying, look at Australia's housing bubble. We'll get into more of the details, but what I really do find is the recent statements by the IMF, which if you want to go through those, I think gives our audience a real sense of the importance of what we're talking about here.
Well, I will, and just before I say that, those same people who said what you just said, that there is none, they said if it was a bubble it would have crashed by now. Well, it did.
It did, yeah.
But then the first homeowners grant was boosted by Rudd to reverse it and prop it back up again, and make it more expensive.
And the defaults from those are now rising.
So the IMF has come out, the so-called authority on the economy, and effectively said the same thing, that we have, the cost burden in property is so large, it's nothing but a bubble. But then they've made, again, a point that echoes what the CEC has made, which is that the looming disaster for property in Australia is actually a looming disaster for the banks, because Australia's banks are completely exposed in a speculative way to this, to these inflated prices in property. On the 25th of January, the Herald Sun quoted the International Monetary Fund saying that Australia's banks should put aside billions more dollars to prepare for a crash in property. Quote, combining residential mortgage shocks with corporate losses expected at the peak of the global financial crisis would put more pressure on Australian banks' capital. It would be useful to consider the merits of higher capital requirements for systematically important domestic banks. Now that's economist speak, Craig, for, this is a disaster.
Yes.
Shore yourselves up, boys. The question I want to ask you as we discuss this, though, why were we able to shout years ago what these authorities, the warnings that these authorities are only making now?
Because we're not looking at the housing situation, Robbie, from a speculative bubble British monetarist system, which we've written a lot about in our New Citizen. We're looking at it from a physical economic point of view. What is the cost to the population of basic economic housing? And I think that's where you have these other analysts and economists looking at the situation in Australia, because, if you have just a bit of a brief look at what these analysts are saying, they're saying things like, if you look at Australia's housing industry, you have this high loan-to-value lending practices, where they lend up to 90, 95, even 100% of the housing values. We know this. This is what the whole speculative thing is built
Which is deliberately reckless.
Yes, of course it is. You have overinflated property prices. The latest demographic, the 8th annual demographic International Housing Affordability Survey has just come out, and in that it's got its incredible graph, which just shows you how poor Australia's housing affordability is. And on this you can see that Sydney, right, it requires 8.5 times the median income in order to be able to pay for a house. Now you have to understand, the standard is 3 times the median income to afford a house. But each of Australia's capital cities are well above that. You're looking at Melbourne is about 6.5. Adelaide is again above 6. The average for Australia is about 6.5 times the median wage.
Australia's capital cities are all in the top 10 around the world.
That's right. And
we dominate that list, in other words.
There's only one place that's higher than us, actually, in the urban areas, and that's Hong Kong. It's about 13. Because Hong Kong's a very
And if there's one place that has an excuse for saying there's not enough land, it's Hong Kong.
Yeah, and of course then you've got things like what these guys are saying, unrealistic vendor expectations, where they're selling this property saying you'll get these great returns back, right? You've also got the large number of second mortgages on houses where banks have just basically said, well, come and get some more money off your house, take another mortgage, buy that boat that you want. So the indebtedness is going through the roof, which is another economist in Australia, Stephen Keane, makes his point about the indebtedness. But all of this is subsumed, of course, by what Lynn LaRouche has been saying, what we've been saying for a long, long period of time. But what these guys warn about is actually they look at the world as a whole, as does LaRouche, and says, look at the reality of what we're in. And these guys in particular, Wirtz, is saying property prices will be on a slippery slope next year when interest rates begin to rise. Now, why is he saying that? Well, he's saying that commodity prices will peak. Right? Why won't they peak? Why won't they fall? We're already talking about the slowing of China's economy and China's demand, and China is exposed to Europe as well.
And the United States.
Right? So it's going to slow. What happens when Australia's exports start to slow? you start to see less money coming in, more demand for prices going up and all sorts of things.
In other words, we don't have an economy that's based on an internal strength of where the wealth in property directly reflects the fact that people own that property and use it to live, and we generate our own income through manufacturing. We don't have that kind of economy.
We're smashing our manufacturing industry, and we're basically at the beck and call of large mining companies for our wealth.
And consequently, economically, we are tossed to and fro on the oceans of the world financial system.
Yeah, and the domestic economists that work for the banks, he who pays the piper calls the tune, that sort of idea. What you see is that they're saying there would have to be, in order for there to be a collapse of the 60% range, the 80% range that these other analysts are talking about, there would need to be sharp rises in interest rates, and that's not going to happen, they're falling. Sharp rises in unemployment, that's not going to happen, they're falling, Sharp rising in housing stocks. Well, hang on, if we're totally dependent on China for everything, and it's highly exposed to Europe, and China starts to go back, it doesn't take much for China to go backwards, then all of a sudden, right, where are the jobs going to go? How are we going to have jobs? So you'll see a rise in unemployment, right? You'll see people unable to afford their houses, more houses come onto the market. You'll also see, if Australia has to compete in a system, an international financial system that's collapsing, particularly with Europe in the state that it's in, Australia's going to have to raise its interest rates, which makes houses more expensive, and consequently you're going to see more people defaulting because they've been swindled into these things through the first homeowner scheme and so forth as a deliberate policy to prop the banks up. I mean, our banks are highly exposed with short-term debt. Something like $800 billion has to be turned over in a very, very short period of time, 3 to 6 months. And if they have to go out into the open market to look for that debt to turn it over, and there's a calamity of what happens in Europe, then we're screwed.
And Craig, just finally on this discussion, we're not agreeing with the IMF. They're echoing us because we have a totally different approach. At the end of the day, the IMF is making these warnings because it's trying to get governments and banking boards, etc., to make decisions to prop up the existing debt.
Well, this is an organisation that's now calling for $1 trillion, Robbie, to be pumped into Europe. And all these companies like the United States, America, and so have to pump in billions of dollars to bail out the banking system in Europe. I mean, this is insane. This is the nature of what we're dealing with now. $1 trillion? I mean, 10 years ago, $1 trillion. You might, anyone that asked for that sort of money, you make sure they were on the next space rocket to the moon if you had one.
You would. All right. We have to leave it there. When we come back, we want to have an interesting discussion about how Australia Day is made in China. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So finally, Australia Day made in China. Yesterday was Australia Day, and a very interesting one as it turned out. So we're going to discuss it a little bit. Australians love celebrating our culture, Craig. I feel so proud to be an Australian. Everyone wants to say that, especially at sporting events. So it's worth discussing. First of all those probably millions of little plastic Australian flags that are getting waved around everywhere are made in China, it turns out.
That's why China likes Australia Day too.
China does. It raises the question, would those Aussies be so patriotic if it wasn't cheap?
Well, I think we should have a policy put through the federal parliament that any memorabilia that is used to celebrate the Australian flag or memorabilia to celebrate Australia Day should be tariff taxed at something like 50 to 60%.
In honour of tariffs and Australia.
In honour of tariffs, Australia and Australian jobs.
Yep.
So that when you're waving that flag, while it might cost you twice as much, you know that you're waving for the future of Australian jobs, right? Whereas right now, it's the Chinese that are laughing, saying thanks very much for your money, and that's the sort of insanity that we are sort of promoting.
It questions the quality of the patriotism we're talking about. Now, but also we have to discuss what happened yesterday in Canberra, where you had these extraordinary scenes with Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott being bundled out of their event by the security because of a protest from the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Now, we don't know a lot about the details. There may have been a rent-a-crowd element there, but one thing we do know is it's a symptom of a broader fact that there is a dark side behind to Australian culture, which the flag waving sort of papers over, or plastics over in the case of the flags. Our culture likes to pretend it isn't there. And the other example, Aborigines have 20% less life expectancy than the rest of Australia. The other example is the way we treat refugees. There was a scandal this week because a Western Australian academic surveyed flag wavers in Perth from last year, and she found a significant proportion of those were of the F off, we're full persuasion, which is a ridiculous idea. Craig, have these people seen the size of Western Australia?
Well, this is actually, as you say, this racist aspect of Australia is endemic. It goes way back to the White Australia policy, that the fear of foreigners. But the irony is that, there was a big fear about amongst the Australian population, particularly the white Australians, about the influx of immigrants after World War II. But look where we are now. We embrace the extra cultural events like the Italians, the Greeks and so forth. They've assimilated, they've come in, they've brought, and they've made a tremendous contribution. Same with the Vietnamese, during the Vietnamese wars back in the 70s. People come in, they assimilate, their children grow up, they become Australians in the sense of making a contribution. Here we are with 22 million people, right? A country that's actually empty. And we've got this insanity of the, both the opposition and the government pushing these policies that are, like the refugee policies, that are basically dehumanising people that are desperate to come and make a contribution. So, these are absolutely insane laws. It plays into the hand of politicians to always play on the negative side of people because it costs politicians.
And on the theme that we opened up this report with, free trade, most of these people, these Australians waving their Chinese flags, they would support Australian manufacturing, but they allow themselves to get sucked into political arguments and be whipped up to distract their gaze in the wrong direction. Yeah, and that's what's got to change.
That's exactly the point, Rob. That's why I come back to the point that when you start to look at policies where you're promoting the good of Australia, so things are a bit more expensive, yes, but look, it promotes Australian jobs. You don't have the layoffs necessary in order to be able to produce those goods because you're increasing your physical economy, you're producing something.
Well, Craig, I wanted to, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to read one verse from a poem that should be much more famous than it is. It's from the person that we regard as Australia's greatest ever poet, Charles Harper, who was from the mid-1800s. He wrote a poem called This Southern Land of Ours, which was a real polemic to the Australian people. Yeah. And I'll just read the first stanza. It goes, "With clowns to make our laws, and knaves to rule us as of old, in vain our soil is rich, in vain 'tis seamed with virgin gold. But the present only yields us naught, the future only lowers, till we have a braver manhood in this southern land of ours." And Harper goes on like that for two other stanzas.
I think that captures it very well, the different mindset that you have to have amongst the so-called free trading politicians as opposed to real nationalists like McEwen and so forth.
But while the manhood isn't brave enough, we're going to have these pygmy statesmen, yes, or knaves and fools, clowns. All right, we're out of time. Before we go, we've released our DVD, The Plot to Shut Down the Murray-Darling Food Bowl, The Fraud of Ecosystems. Everyone watch it on our website. Thanks for tuning in.